on trade with China, so we have to proceed carefully and diplomatically.
Okay. It's lovely having you both on the program, Stephen Jacoby and Anna Fifield. Kia ora. Thank you.
Kia ora, Anna.
Yeah, kia ora, Steve. And thank you so much, Wallace.
Yes,
Thanks, Wallace.
lovely to have you on. Got a couple of minutes, got a sort of 30 seconds to action. Now, that's us right there. Wanted to sneak in some more sticker shock feedback, but we will come to that issue maybe tomorrow or the day after. But for now, thank you very much for being with us. I'm Wallace Chapman, back tomorrow 3:45. Bye.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, the Kiwi rail train that split apart mid-trip. What went wrong on Te Huia's commute to Hamilton? A bunch of countries, including New Zealand, name and shame China for hack attacks aimed at pinching valuable intellectual property and spying. The Chinese embassy here slaps down the allegations. The doctors who think New Zealand immigration needs resuscitating. A call for tighter COVID rules for ship crews as the number of cases on board 3 vessels grows. Almost 90 West Coast families need new roofs over their heads while their old one is rebuilt or repaired thanks to flooding. And the stampede to UK dance floors. Don't forget, you can watch us live on Facebook.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, ko Susana Leata with DNA. The government has refused to be interviewed about its surprise condemnation of China for state-sponsored hacking. New Zealand late last night joined an unprecedented grouping of US allies blaming damaging cyber attacks on China's State Security Ministry. Here's our political deputy editor, Craig McCulloch.
The statement landed after 11 last night with a stern censure of China. We call for an end to this type of malicious activity. Foreign policy watchers in New Zealand have called the position remarkable, significant and unusually firm. But the statement stands alone. A spokesperson says it's complete, and the Minister for Intelligence Agencies, Andrew Little, has declined interviews today. The Chinese embassy says the claims are groundless and irresponsible.
West Coast volunteers have been busy trying to help people made homeless by flooding. More than 150 people are being accommodated in 3 evacuation centres in Westport. Volunteer Chantel Murphy, who has been trying to support elderly friends and neighbours, says 90-year-old Alma was struggling with being away from home.
And she was very muddled from the whole ordeal, but she's so happy to be home, and I'm so glad it was dry and the power was on. But as you can see, I'm still with a lot of other friends trying to help and get them comfortable and do whatever I can, just whatever I can.
West Coast Emergency Management says 89 homes have now been red listed as having severe or total damage. Hosting the America's Cup this year cost the country $293 million more than it got in economic spin-offs from the event. An evaluation report released by the Crown and the Auckland Council shows that for every dollar spent, less than half, 48 cents, was recovered. Taking into account social and environmental benefits, the total loss has been calculated at $156 million. Auckland Unlimited Chief Executive Nick Hill says they were actually expecting worse.
We were pleasantly pleased with the results, actually. We've come through COVID. It was an amazing achievement for the event to happen at all. So the results are actually surprisingly good.
South Australia is about to join Sydney and Victoria in COVID lockdown. 5 cases of the Delta variant have been confirmed there. And at 8:30 tonight, New Zealand time, the state will enter a strict 7-day lockdown. At the same time, Victoria's snap lockdown, which had been due to end at midnight tonight, has been extended for another week. A former senior advisor to the British Prime Minister, Dominic Cummings, has made a series of damning new allegations about Boris Johnson's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. Mr Cummings says Mr Johnson resisted the idea of a second lockdown last year by arguing the virus mainly affected the elderly.
His attitude at that point was a weird mix of partly it's all nonsense and lockdowns don't work anyway. And partly, this is terrible, but the people who are dying are essentially all over 80. And we can't kill the economy just because of people dying over 80.
Downing Street has rejected the allegations, saying Mr Johnson has always done what's necessary to protect lives, guided by scientific advice. A passenger on the Auckland to Hamilton commuter train says there was a loud screech before two carriages became separated from the main engine. An investigation is underway into what happened to the Kiwi Rail service yesterday afternoon. Kylie O'Meara was on board with her teenage children and says they had only been travelling for about 10 minutes when the carriage they were in came loose.
We went across a level crossing and then it just started to make this god-awful screeching noise, and it almost sounded steel on steel, but it was obviously the emergency brakes coming on.
Kylie O'Meara says no one was hurt and she did not feel unsafe during the incident, which Kiwi Rail is now investigating. A motorcyclist has died after a serious crash this afternoon on State Highway 2 on the Remutaka Hill north of Wellington, and the road remains closed. Waka Kotahi cannot confirm when the road will be clear. It's 5:04. Two-time Olympic rowing champion Hamish Bond admits there's a different feeling in the Tokyo Athletes Village to any of the 3 previous Olympics he's attended. Bond, who competed at the Beijing, London and Rio Games, is one of the New Zealand team's 2 flag bearers. Since arriving in the village at the weekend, he has detected a sense of nervousness.
It's just an air of caution and a little bit of weariness from across the quarters, and that's the way we need to be, to look after ourselves and also, I guess, the Japanese public and the people that are hosting us here. So it's just a different reality.
All Blacks coach Ian Foster believes the Wallabies will have a spring in their step heading into this year's Bledisloe Cup, while the All Blacks have had 3 top-sided wins this month. Australia won a dramatic series against France in which all 3 tests went down to the wire. Foster says the Wallabies will feel upbeat ahead of the opening Bledisloe test in just over 2 weeks.
When you get through tight games, you learn a bit about yourself, and so I'm sure they're feeling good about that. Same side, we've been able to get some of our objectives done in our own program, and can't wait for Eden Park.
Meanwhile, Wallabies wing Marika Koroyambeti will be available for that series after escaping any further sanction for a red card in the 3rd test against France. He had faced suspension after being sent off for a high tackle. That's the news.
A new global alliance turns its gaze to Chinese hackers.
These attacks largely undetected, and that should really be a wake-up call for companies not just in the United States but in New Zealand.
Batches at flood risk as the earth heats up.
It's the same story. There's more moisture in the air everywhere in the world.
And a Kiwi Olympian preps for the Games.
If I can do it, why not try?
Tried and tested. Morning report weekdays from 6 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Taranaki, including Coromandel Peninsula. Long fine breaks, isolated showers. Rain spreading south tomorrow afternoon and evening. Bay of Plenty and Central High Country. Becoming fine tonight. A few showers developing tomorrow morning, then rain tomorrow night. Whanganui and Manawatu, also Gisborne through to Wairarapa. Fine tonight, apart from isolated showers in Whanganui, Manawatu and Gisborne. High cloud tomorrow, a period of evening rain tomorrow. Horowhenua to Wellington, mainly fine with the odd shower. A few showers tomorrow morning, then evening rain. Nelson and Marlborough, also Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, mainly fine tonight. Isolated showers. Widespread showers tomorrow, then rain from tomorrow night, briefly heavy. For Canterbury, Otago and Southland, fine apart from areas of low cloud. Rain spreading north from tomorrow afternoon. Chatham Islands, rain clearing tonight, then cloudy periods. RNZ National at 5:07.
Kia ora rā e hoa, tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki Checkpoint I tēnei rā, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. An investigation's underway after 2 carriages broke away from the main train on a Kiwi Rail commuter service between Auckland and Hamilton. The controversial Te Huia was heading towards Pukekohe in an 80-kilometre zone yesterday evening when, without warning, it pulled apart, causing the emergency brakes to lock on. No one was hurt. Kylie O'Meara was on board one of the 2 breakaway carriages.
We were basically 10 minutes into our trip, so the lady hadn't come around to collect our fares off the prepaid card that you have. So literally 10 minutes into the trip, we went across a level crossing, and when we went across that level crossing, something occurred, and so we had the engine and then two carriages. We were in the back two carriages, so we were the front of the two carriages that separated. And so we went across a level crossing, and then it just started to make this god-awful screeching noise, and it almost sounded steel on steel, but it was obviously the emergency brakes coming on. Yeah, basically the back two carriages separated from the engine and the front two carriages.
Services were temporarily suspended but are expected to be back to normal tomorrow. In the meantime, Kiwi Rail's trying to work out how and why the train split mid-trip. Kiwi Rail's Acting Chief Operating Officer, Walter Rushbrook, describes what happened.
About 20 minutes into the journey, the train parted and the rear two carriages drifted apart from the front part of the train. So when that occurs, all the emergency systems kick into place and the train automatically stops.
So when you say that the carriages, parted company with the rest of the train, how so?
We're undertaking an investigation to find out what the cause of the incident is. Partings like this are very, very rare. So, we've got an engineering team doing an investigation at the moment.
What sort of terrain was the train on at that time?
It was just south of Auckland, so it's a double-track area. I think the line speed about that area is about 70 to 80 kilometres per hour.
And do the emergency brakes just slam on when the carriages come apart?
Yeah, there's a comprehensive safety system. So as I said, it's a very rare event. But when you do have these rare events, there's all types of safety systems that come on. So train brakes work by having the brakes held off. So when the train parts, they automatically come on.
How are the carriages connected?
They've got a coupling system. They're called auto couplers. You can sort of visualise them like two metal hands tightly locked together.
And when the carriages are joined, does someone do that manually? Like when you put a trailer onto a tow bar on a car?
It's similar to that, and there's a number of other comprehensive checks. So before each train journey, somebody does a check of the train, as well as all the regular maintenance and inspections that take place on the carriages.
So Walter, just to be clear, so that we've got this right, a worker, has to connect the carriages together using that coupling system?
Correct, and it's checked before each train journey.
Okay. Were the checks done on this train?
That's part of the investigation. I'd assume it's the case, but the investigation will find that out for sure.
Okay. After the carriages came apart, what happened?
The train came to a halt, as I mentioned before. So then the train was reconnected back together. The passengers were moved into the front part of the train, and the train went through to Pukekohe, and the passengers were then transferred onto buses and trains for the rest of their journey.
When did the train driver realise that they were missing a couple of carriages?
Oh, he would have known straight away because effectively the emergency brakes of the train come on.
So after the train had detached, did the driver back up and reconnect the two carriages?
Yes, that's correct, under the guidance of the crew on board.
Okay, so Walter, doesn't that suggest to you that there's nothing wrong with the coupling system if you were able to reattach the two carriages and carry on your journey?
Yeah, so what we did is when we reattached it, we did a full inspection of the coupling, and then we went on to Pukekohe at slow speed at 20 kilometres per hour, just as an extra safety precaution. And then we took the train effectively out of service for the public at that point.
Okay, got you on that one, Walter, but my point is this. The fact that you were able to recouple the two carriages that parted company with the main train shows that the coupling system was still fully functional, wasn't it? You were able to reattach them and safely carry on your way until you got into the station.
Yeah, when I say we travelled with extra precautions in place, so we're able to recouple it. The coupling mechanism was still functioning.
Yeah, it wasn't broken in any way as far as you could tell.
Well, yeah, and that's what the investigation will be looking into. So the investigation will be looking at the couplings, the train handling, the track conditions. The train also has a black box on board, so that we'll find out information about the characteristics of the train right at the point of the partnering.
With the information you currently have, does it suggest this was human error?
No, it's way too early to say at this point. And yeah, that's the point of the investigation. We've got an engineering team in Hamilton at the moment who are leading that work.
Just if I can go back to when the train pulled apart, basically. So there are adjoining sections of the train where people can walk between carriages. Yes.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. So what would have happened if someone had been walking between those two carriages when it came apart?
Well, when a train typically parts, and we'll find this out in the investigation, it's not like they move apart very quickly. They just drift apart, and then the emergency brakes come on. So in the unlikely circumstance that somebody was there, they might be able to move out of the way. But no one was there at the time of this parting.
Could have been pretty catastrophic, though, couldn't it?
I'll be speculating, but potentially, I guess, yes.
Yeah, you're lucky nobody was on the move at the time the train came apart.
Yes.
So this train, wow, it's got a bit of a bad rap, hasn't it? Low passenger numbers. It takes 90 minutes to get into the city. You have to change. It's not a one-train wonder. And once a week you go into the Strand. I mean, what do you think this is doing to its reputation?
Well, we're committed to the service, along with our council partners and other stakeholders involved in the train. So there's a commitment through to 2024. So passenger numbers have been growing, and we're expecting that to continue into the future.
And that's Walter Rushbrook from Kiwi Rail. It is almost 5:15 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Kia ora rawatu mo te whakarongo mai e haere aki nei. The COVID vaccination rollout rolls into the tiny east coast town of Te Araroa. The Chinese embassy has accused New Zealand of spreading groundless and irresponsible claims about cyber attacks and what it calls a malicious smear. The reproach comes after the government joined an unprecedented grouping of United States allies denouncing China for state-sponsored hacking. Anai te kai reporter, Craig McCulloch, our deputy political editor.
It's a fine red line New Zealand walks in its relationship with China, and even more precarious now.
Breaking news this morning, the U.S. and key allies are joining forces against China.
Today, the U.S. and its allies accused China publicly of a global computer hacking and cyber espionage campaign.
The U.S. and its allies pointing the finger now at China as the major threat to cyber.
The White House leading an unprecedented lineup of condemners: NATO, the European Union, Australia, Britain, Canada, Japan, and yes, New Zealand, all formally calling out China for hacking.
The Chinese government, not unlike the Russian government, is not doing this themselves, but are protecting those who are doing it, and maybe even accommodating them being able to do it.
The New Zealand government has issued a statement in line with the sentiment, accusing Chinese state-sponsored actors of malicious cyber activity here and abroad. It's not the first time New Zealand has called out China for such action, but the coordinated approach signals escalating tensions.
There is a fair likelihood that there will be some payback coming down the line.
Professor Alexander Gillespie from Waikato University says New Zealand's stance is a remarkable one, not so much for the actual position, but because of the potential backlash.
It would have been very easy for New Zealand to have been silent, but we've decided to get involved, and we're at the forefront of this, and it takes a lot of bravery to speak like this and to say it as it is. Worst case scenario, you could find trade difficulties. And
that is a worrying prospect. China is New Zealand's number one trading partner, with two-way trade exceeding $33 billion. The former intelligence analyst Paul Buchanan says it makes New Zealand particularly vulnerable.
New Zealand has sort of stuck its neck out here, but you know what? I think at some point the actions of states in this domain become intolerable. And clearly the limits of toleration have been reached, even for a small, vulnerable state like New Zealand. And so that's the situation we find ourselves in.
At this stage, the collective approach and lack of any concrete punitive action will likely limit any blowback. But the threat is there. In a statement, the Chinese embassy in New Zealand has described the accusations as groundless and irresponsible. It's raised objections directly with the government, urging it to stop its mudslinging and abandon its Cold War mentality. The Beijing-linked state media outlet Global Times has gone even further. In an editorial, it says, if the US takes aggressive measures, we will retaliate. It goes on, US allies which follow the US won't benefit either.
And later in the programme, we'll speak to GCSB boss about calling China out. It is 18 minutes past 5. Kia amo tonu mai. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. A Northland doctor says she's been waiting more than a year for Immigration New Zealand to respond to her family's residency application. That's despite reported shortages of medical professionals in Northland. And she's not alone. Checkpoint has spoken to some of her colleagues who say their futures are also up in the air. Here's Nick Trubridge.
We've had no communication. We've just had blank answers to anything. And we've just been left, we feel very much in limbo, like we're neither here nor there.
It's been over a year in limbo for Dr. Fiona Bowles. She's been waiting to see whether she can buy a house here or if she can access disability services for one of her children. That's because the British doctor has been waiting to know whether she and her young family can stay in New Zealand.
It's been really hard, in these times of uncertainty to feel so unsettled as to whether we're staying, whether we're going to be able to stay or whether we're going to have to go back to the UK at the end of our work visas.
Mother of two, Dr. Bowles is working in Northland's stretched medical system as an emergency medicine consultant. Her husband, Chris, is working here as a radiologist.
If he has to go home, then that's going to mean people are waiting longer to have their cancer diagnosed. They're going to be waiting longer for their surgery. If I go, it's going to mean longer waits in the emergency department waiting room. That's the impact. If the GPs go, it's even longer waits for GP appointments.
They're desperate to stay and keep serving Northlanders' medical needs. But Immigration New Zealand is yet to come to the party.
We've written to the Immigration Minister, we've written multiple times through our lady who helps us with immigration stuff, our advisor. We've just had nothing back, just radio silence, really. And, if we had this is what's happening, this is when we're planning to do it, or even this is why we can't do it, we had some kind of explanation or communication, it would be a lot easier, but we're just guessing.
And it's not like Northland is overflowing with medical professionals like Fiona and Chris Bowles. A quick Google search chucks up plenty of headlines on Northland's stretched health services.
I've absolutely fallen in love with Northland. It's such an incredible privilege to be able to work with people there, and there's so much need. And if we don't act together and raise the profile of this, the already critical healthcare shortages are going to get worse and worse and worse.
Dr. Bowles says this isn't just a story about her and her husband. She says general practitioners in Northland are facing similar issues getting residency despite shortages in the region. One of Dr. Bowles' colleagues, Northland emergency medicine consultant Dr. Bob Riching, moved his family from the United States and is also seeking residency. He too is in the dark.
The dilemma that I'm facing is, we're trying to sort of plan for the future and set up our lives. And I don't know, am I going to be here for 3 years and have to leave, or am I going to be able to stay indefinitely? Because that sort of makes a difference to kind of how we set things up for ourselves.
Duncan Cottrell, partner and immigration lawyer Nicola Tiffin, told Checkpoint she was particularly surprised to hear Dr. Bowles had been waiting over a year to hear back on her residency application.
Their operational instructions direct that first priority will be given to applicants who have current occupational registration, where registration is required. So medical practitioners fall squarely in that priority section of applicants.
She says the only other way to get priority is if you're earning over $112,000 per annum, with others waiting close to 2 years for residence visas to be processed.
There's two aspects of this issue. So there's the people who have applied for residence and were able to submit applications before the government effectively suspended the skilled migrant category. And those people, unless they're earning that figure I mentioned before, over $112,000, or have occupational registration, they're waiting up to 2 years for their residence.
Tiffin says the only other way to get residency is through a work to residence visa or the long-term skills shortage list. Otherwise, you might just have to marry a Kiwi.
Immigration New Zealand says expressions of interest for the skilled migrant program have been suspended since last April before the BAL's application. However, individuals are still able to be placed in the pool for selection. Immigration New Zealand maintains it's giving priority to some skilled migrant and residents from work applications for highly paid applicants and applicants with current occupational registration. Homai o whakaro, no reira anei na kaupapa mo te hōtaka nei. Do you think immigration is dragging the chain here or not? Are these people being made to wait too long, or is this the new post-COVID reality? Pātohi mai, text me 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or you can email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Australia's COVID crisis goes on. From tonight, South Australia will go into a 7-day lockdown after health authorities confirmed 5 local cases of the Delta strain, while Victoria has extended its lockdown for a further 7 days. Meanwhile, New South Wales has recorded 78 new local cases, at least 21 of which are believed to have been infectious in the community. And as new modelling shows, Greater Sydney's hard lockdown may have to last until late August. A 5th death linked to the outbreak has been confirmed. The ABC's Gavin Coote has more from the city.
The death of a woman in her 50s inside her southwest Sydney home underscores the tragic and fast-moving nature of the Delta strain. Charlotte Hespy is the New South Wales chair of the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners.
I think I could probably sum it up in deep sadness and just a wish that we could protect more of our community at this point in time.
The woman was found dead at her Green Valley home in the Liverpool area yesterday and was later confirmed as a COVID-19 case. She was the mother of 2 removalists who travelled from Sydney to the state's Central West while infectious and who've been charged with breaching public health orders.
What we do know is that usually when it does become quite nasty, I think in the lungs, it can happen very quickly, which is why it's really important to try and be in contact with everybody who has COVID throughout their illness so that we can pick up when they do become so unwell that they need to be in hospital.
New South Wales is still reporting high case numbers, with yesterday's tally at 98. But the biggest concern is that 20 were infectious in the community. The spread within households remains the number one challenge, particularly in southwest Sydney, where more than 2/3 of the state's cases are being recorded. And with a growing number of younger people getting very sick with COVID, Charlotte Hespy says the best hope they have of avoiding this is getting vaccinated.
Although it might not stop you getting infected, nor does it stop you transmitting it to others, it does significantly reduce both of those things, but more importantly, it really keeps people out of hospital and does prevent death.
Around 16% of the population have now received at least one dose of the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine. The Ministry of Health wants to get through 1.6 million doses in 3 weeks in September alone. The vaccine rollout is now heading further out to more isolated and regional communities. In Tairāwhiti, people in the small far east town of Te Araroa have been getting their second dose of the vaccine today. Despite a good turnout, they're still battling against misinformation. Anei te kairi poata a Tom Kitchen a Te Araroa.
It's the first place in the world to see the sun on a new day. And for the people in the tiny town of Te Araroa, the closest town to Aotearoa's eastern tip, today was for the COVID vaccine. 22-year-old Latasha Wanoa says it's an important day.
We're very rural and we're isolated, and a lot of our population are made up of vulnerable people. We're made up of our elderly, and it's just from our values. We make sure that we look after our elderly and our children, so it's really important that we maintain those values across everything, including COVID vaccines.
3 weeks ago, the 200-odd residents of Te Araroa got their first COVID-19 Pfizer vaccine. Now they're at Hinerupe Marae for the second. They're doing it a little differently to the main centres. They're not following the ministry's group system. Ngāti Porou Haora's Karalipi Whairangi Lawton, who's leading the rollout, says that wouldn't have worked here.
We would have found our staff burning out with having to do the vaccination program as well. So we made a decision to have an open door policy, so to speak, and invite whānau to come and be vaccinated, and that nobody would be turned away if they turned up.
She says if the virus ever hit, it would spell disaster.
Our services in Ngāti Porou and on the East Coast are very limited. We have a small hospital in Te Huia Springs, but if COVID had have struck us here, we would have been unable to cope.
She's pleased with the uptake, but knows it could be even better.
For the first dose, we had about 62% of eligible population. So we were really wrapped with that as a first take. There's a lot of information or misinformation out there.
80-year-old Rārawa Kōhere says whānau can easily overcome the false information.
I think Ngāti Porou generally, the hapu and the whānau and that makeup are very practical, common sense, focused people.
Marae trustee Carolina Ngāti Melbourne says there are still some anti-vaxxers around, and many are doing all they can to change that.
What we're finding really in front of us at the moment, and a priority for us as a community, is to teach our whānau not to believe an opinion, not to be misinformed.
She says the rollout here is by the community, for the community.
We, our own people, we wouldn't make the decisions on what sort of resourcing is going to go into our community.
Posters are plastered around the area promoting the vaccine, reading, "Protect our kai mahi, protect our hapu."
And you already see there are posters around here today. Those are all our own people. Now, when people came in for the first vaccine, they were drawn to those photos because they're us. If we would have gone ahead with the Ministry of Health poster, probably would have been a COVID, the COVID logo, and people would have just gone, oh yeah, same picture we've been seeing for 12 months or so.
The message worked for local man Aidan, who's just had his second dose of the vaccine.
I thought it would be the right thing to do, yeah, for all the old people in the public, yeah.
It may not be in line with the rollout for the rest of the country, but for this small community, it's just what works.
More New Zealand athletes have been arriving at the Olympic Village in Tokyo today ahead of the Games, officially getting underway Friday. Ko taku hoa anai nei ko Maya Burry, who is in Tokyo. Kia ora, Maya. So New Zealand's presence in Tokyo is growing?
Kia ora, Lisa. It's definitely growing. That village, it's really filling up. Today, the men's sevens as well as the shooting and diving athletes from New Zealand, they've arrived in the village with their support staff. And look, it's getting definitely busy here. As you say, that opening ceremony taking place on Friday. But ahead of that, we'll see the football and the baseball get underway from tomorrow. So I'm joining you tonight, for those that are watching, I'm joining you from the main press centre here at Tokyo 2020. Behind me, rows and rows of desks, hundreds of journalists from different countries around the world. Everyone's masked up here, plastic dividers between tables, and everyone's preparing for a very busy time of games to get underway.
Yeah, Maya, looking behind you, and you can see quite a few journos there, right? And you say the perspex between. I mean, are they expecting you to sit in the same seat every time and wipe down after yourself, or what's the drill?
Well, the drill, it's a bit of common sense. Certainly different media outlets sticking to their own little bubbles, just like sports teams here are sticking to their bubbles. But also there's a lot of Tokyo 2020 staff here who, whenever you get up from a table, they'll quickly rush to the table and give it a wipe down, that sort of thing. Also any microphones that are being used for interviews, that sort of thing, they're all getting disinfected. So lots of different measures in place here.
Hey, the opening ceremony kicking off on Friday, what can you tell us about how that's going to work?
Yeah, definitely not going to be your bog standard opening ceremony. I don't expect to see any fans shouting or clapping. There'll be no spectators or supporters at the opening ceremony. The New Zealand Olympic Committee is still waiting to hear from the International Olympic Committee just exactly what procedures are going to be in place. But as I mentioned earlier, the New Zealand team, the sports teams, they've all been sort of sticking to their own bubbles within the wider New Zealand team. So we could expect to see some spacing between them when they do attend the opening ceremony. Also, I've been speaking today to flag bearer Hamish Bond. He's a New Zealand rower, and I've asked him what he's expecting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the opportunity to lead the team. It's obviously going to be a slightly different scenario with no spectators and somewhat muted, but I think it'll be years in the future maybe where you look back and you can reflect on that opportunity. That will be pretty special.
So Maya, is there any COVID-related news coming out of Tokyo today ahead of the Olympics?
Well, it does all kind of feel like it's all COVID-related news, really. This is just such an interesting games happening in a global pandemic. But the latest from the village, no news to report today in terms of athletes testing positive for COVID. On Sunday, we learnt of those two South African footballers who were confirmed as having COVID. And then late yesterday evening, it was reported that a volleyball player from the Czech Republic had tested positive. The IOC has since confirmed that, and they've been placed into 14 days of isolation. But at that, the total stands at 3.
Thanks, Maya. That is reporter Maya Burry joining us from Tokyo. E te iwi e haere nei e a checkpoint, a call for tighter COVID rules for ship crews with 3 vessels at the centre of COVID clusters. Westport searches for temporary housing solutions post-flood, and it could be nightclub turned COVID club as a posse of people hit UK dance floors. Homai o whakaaro, we'd love your feedback on anything you've heard on the programme this evening. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or send us an email. The address is checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. It is time now for the headlines. Ko Susana anō tēnei.
Kia ora, Lisa. The government has refused to be interviewed about its surprise condemnation of China for state-sponsored hacking. New Zealand late last night joined an unprecedented grouping of United States allies, blaming damaging cyber attacks on China's State Security Ministry. The Chinese embassy says the claims are groundless and irresponsible. The Minister for Intelligence Agencies, Andrew Little, has declined interviews today, and a spokesperson says he has no more to add to his statement. Emergency systems kicked in straight away when 2 carriages of a commuter train became separated from the engine. An investigation's underway into what happened to the KiwiRail service between Hamilton and Auckland yesterday afternoon. KiwiRail's acting Chief Operating Officer Walter Rushbrook told Checkpoint that it was a rare event and the braking system automatically engaged. He says it was too early to determine if it was human error. A passenger on the train says no one was hurt and she did not feel unsafe during the incident. The head of an economic development agency says the losses from hosting the America's Cup could have been much worse given it was hosted during the COVID pandemic. The hosting of the event cost New Zealand $293 million, more than it got in economic spin-offs from the event. The total loss has been calculated at $156 million. But Auckland Unlimited's chief executive Nick Hill says they were actually expecting worse. South Australia will join Victoria in lockdown later today as Australia continues to battle with a rapidly spreading outbreak of the Delta variant of COVID-19. The South Australian health authorities have identified 5 cases linked to the current cluster, but the latest confirmed infection is not part of the family of the original case. In New South Wales, the state's Chief Health Officer, Kerry Chant, also says she remains concerned about the number of people now needing high-level hospital care, with 78 new cases reported today. Those are the latest news headlines on RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susana. No mai hoki mai. If you're just joining us, this is Checkpoint. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Kei kōna, Nona Peltier, me ngā kaupapa kai Pākehē. Nona is in the studio to talk business news. Genesis Genesis has decided to keep its stake in the Kupe gas fields. Now, what's behind that decision?
Well, they decided in early this year to review the investment. So they have a 46%. Is it 46? Yeah, 46% stake in the field, and they thought, well, maybe it would be better if somebody else owned that stake rather than Genesis, and maybe they could do something different with their investment. And then they decided no, that their stake was worth more to them than anyone else. So they decided no, they're going to keep their stake and they're going to look at what they can do to improve its production. So they think that there's enough, maybe 10 plus years left in that field in terms of natural gas, and but they're suggesting that there is going to be a need for some infrastructure investment to keep that natural gas available for those days when our renewable energy, which we're moving towards 100%, is not available. So, for example, we don't get enough rain, so the hydro lakes aren't filled, or it's not windy, so we don't get as much wind power, or the sun doesn't shine, that kind of idea. So that you need that natural gas to provide a security of service. Otherwise, you have to burn coal. So no one wants to burn coal because that's much more carbon intensive than natural gas. And so what Genesis is saying is that the natural gas facility is essential to the New Zealand energy security. They're going to need it to fill in those gaps. But what's going to happen is over time, as our renewable energy increases, we're going to use less natural gas. So at the moment, it's always flowing. But in the future, it's not going to be used as much. So we're going to have to store it somewhere so that it is ready and available for those days when we need it. And that we don't have the storage facility right now. So that's going to be one of the things that Genesis will be looking at over the next year with joint venture partners. It's also looking at whether or not it might make a new well. It has an existing right over the field, so it doesn't need to get new permits because those are not going to be forthcoming under the government's policy. So it's going to be a really interesting time, but for sure, natural gas is going to be in the mix for at least 10 years plus.
Okay. Let's talk about Westpac now. It's dropped its KiwiSaver fund fees. What does that mean and why?
Yeah, so people might recall that there was some guidelines that was put out by the Financial Markets Authority in April. And these were guidelines which said, you fund managers, whether it's a KiwiSaver or the type of fund like a mutual fund, you have to justify the fees that you charge your customers. And you have to make sure that they're getting value for money. And as your funds increase, that the scale that you're achieving is those savings are passed on to those customers. You can't just continue to charge more and more and more or leave fees at the same level. So you have to report every year that the fees that you are charging offer consumers value for money. So Westpac, which is, actually one more thing happened. Then the government changed their default savers, Westpac being one of them. And Westpac today announced that they were going to cut their fees by as much as 25 basis points. So that's a significant saving. And they were also going to remove their annual $12 a year administration fee.
Right, so they've got out the trimmer.
They've got the trimmer out. And so the Financial Markets Authority is thrilled that that's the case, even though the Westpac folks aren't giving the FMA credit for that. Certainly the FMA think that this is going to be something we're going to see a lot more of. So, watch your...
As it gets more competitive.
Well, it's not just
competitive.
Their
fees.
They're going to have to account for themselves. You can't just keep on charging people whatever on your KiwiSaver. So, there's going to be a little bit of accounting done by various fund managers across the country.
And what have you got from the markets today?
Well, it was an interesting day. Look, Asian markets are down because the fear of the Delta variant is really spreading concern as the global economy seems to sputter back to life. Anyways, overall, though, we basically fell 1 point, just one, to 12,651. That's not a massive drop, is it? And the New Zealand dollar, we dropped almost a whole cent against the US dollar, 69 cents US now. And that's mostly because people are afraid, and so they've decided to go to the US dollar, and that's boosted it. But against the Australian, we're steady pretty much, 94.2 Australian and 50.5 pence. So it's really just that story about the US dollar.
Thanks, Nona. Nona Peltier with Business. The ACT Party is being accused of dog whistle politics and separatism with its latest policies aimed at reducing gang-related crime. The party released its law and order policy document in Wellington today. The policies include placing injunctions on gang members and stopping their welfare payments being used for alcohol, tobacco and gambling by electronically monitoring spending. Here's political reporter Charlie Drever.
The ACT Party held its law and order policy launch at Wellington CBD's Danger Bar. But according to its owner, Matt McLaughlin, the danger is actually outside on the surrounding streets.
We are seeing a massive increase in gang members. Two of the well-publicised fights that have happened in the last couple of months, we do know that there were gang fights and, that sort of stuff we've never seen in Wellington, and we're starting to see it more and more often, and I just think that it needs to change.
Matt McLaughlin loves the ACT Party's raft of policies that crack down on gangs. Party leader David Seymour says the government has been favouring gangs over the safety of law-abiding citizens.
Constantly empowering the gangs is the dangerous side of Jacinda's kindness, and we need to reprioritise the rights of law-abiding citizens ahead of criminals and criminal organisations.
As well as imposing restrictions on benefit spending, ACT wants to give police the power to apply for injunction orders for gang members. The person with an order would need to be on the national gang list, and police would need to believe there is a risk of gang-related violence or drug dealing. Those with an order could be barred from certain areas and made to go through rehabilitation programs. They could also be prohibited from associating with certain people. But what does that mean for family and whānau within gangs?
If those family links are strong, I suspect the pressure will come on not to join a gang.
To have the sanctions lifted, David Seymour says people will have to prove they are no longer affiliated to a gang. Te Pāti Māori co-leader Raweri Waititi says these policies will just target the marginalised and disenfranchised.
This is absolutely separatist, it is absolutely apartheid, it's state control over who we can interact with, who can be whānau and who can't be whānau. And I'm absolutely, really disappointed that the ACT Party has gone down this track, but I'm not surprised.
He says ACT once again fails to understand gangs and why they exist.
ACT's proposition doesn't address the ultimate cause of the whakapapa of gangs, which is deeply rooted in colonisation. The dispossession of our land and our culture. Instead of their rhetoric reflects a deeply short-sighted view that lacks substance or sustainability.
Community advocate and lifetime Black Power member Dennis O'Reilly reckons David Seymour has lost the plot on these policies.
I mean, it's a bit absurd when you start to think about it. I'm all for people not smoking and not gambling and all those sorts of things, but I think they're sort of human rights and choices type of thing. It doesn't seem to me to be consistent with the philosophy of that party I know as ACT.
He also took exception to ACT wanting to use the national gang list.
The Commissioner of Police has said that the National Gang Register is not worth the paper it's written on. We see the numbers go up. I keep on burying people. I don't see the numbers go down. So it's so loose and it's just dog whistle politics. It's silly, frankly, and I'm disappointed that David, who otherwise has made a pretty good contribution to the parliamentary term so far, would jump on the bandwagon.
David Seymour says he is a strong believer in a free and democratic society, but adds what use are those freedoms if people are being intimidated by gangs.
It's 5:45. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. He muriaki na pita kōrero after the news at 6, the boss of the government's cyber security agency. A call for crew joining boats in New Zealand waters to come through managed isolation and return a negative COVID test before heading out to sea. At the moment, health and border authorities are dealing with multiple COVID cases across 3 vessels. 2 of them had fresh crew fly into New Zealand to join the boats. The crews don't have to go into MIQ on arrival. They're tested for the virus, but can join their boat before the results are back. In the case of the Viking Bay, 2 new crew were already on the ship before their positive results came back and the virus spread rapidly. Captain Ian McLeod is Vice President of the Merchant Service Guild and happens to be in MIQ. He reckons he knows what the problem is.
From the point of the mariner's point of view, it's the pre-testing and isolation of the crews before they join the vessels. I know the container ship in Bluff has come from Fremantle, so I presume it had a crew change there. These guys have come on board with the disease and not done their isolation period. So they've come on the ship, the Australians have said, "Where you go," and they've taken their disease and spread it around the ship, and I wouldn't be surprised if the whole lot of them come down with it.
So in New Zealand, when fresh crew arrive to switch onto boats here, they get tested at the border, but they can transfer onto the boat before the results are in. What do you make of that?
Oh, I think it's just, as a ship's captain, I think it's totally irresponsible. The last thing you need on a ship is COVID. You know, there's not enough people on most of these ships anyway, and you don't want anybody sick. So they should be in isolation and do their 14 days before they join.
So you think they should do a full 14 days? Because there has been a suggestion that that would make things difficult for the industry.
Well, that's it. But at the end of the day, it's also the benefit of all the pilots, the stevedores, and everybody around the New Zealand coast.
So have you had conversations with the Minister or the Ministry around this?
We were on a working group through the union talking with Maritime New Zealand and Ministry of Health, and it was raised early on, very early on, with the pilots and our union, that all crews incoming and those on the coast, so you've got ships coming into New Zealand as well, who aren't being tested.
And is there any undertaking to change things, or what do you want to happen?
Lots of head nodding, but haven't seen any response as such.
And so what is your worst fear here?
I suppose at some stage one of these pilots will get infected. If he has to go into quarantine, all of a sudden there's a limited pool of resources around the country, and the ships will stop moving because you cannot bring a ship into the port without a pilot on board.
Yeah, explain to people what the role of the pilot is and what kind of contact they will have with these crew who are transferring on board.
Okay, so like in the case of the ship down in Bluff, I did speak to the pilots down there. They went through a very, very detailed risk assessment to make sure that there was no contact. I think they kept the pilot on the bridge wing. He came up to the outside accommodation and he was talking to the crews on a radio, so there was no contact. Very, very well thought through and nice and safe. But the normal role of a pilot is to provide local information and guidance to the ship's master to get him from the pilot boarding ground alongside the wharf. The pilot will talk to the tugs and make sure the ship safely gets alongside the wharf.
How do the fishing and freighting industry view the prospect of their people having to go into managed isolation for 14 days if they want to join a ship?
I think it's the incoming seafarers. So you're bringing, say, for example, on the ship I was on, they were trying to bring crews in from the Philippines, and they would have literally come into Auckland, had a couple of days, and then onto the ship. So, yeah, they stay in isolation in a van straight down to the ship. So that's how they would do it. I'm sorry, I can't comment on the freighting industry or the fishing. At the end of the day, I know my own particular situation here is that I'm here because the public health in Littleton wouldn't test the ship. They took instructions from the charterers of the vessel, from Maersk, who said don't test the ship because they don't want the ships to be delayed. So the instructions came from India, don't test the ship. So that's why, as a result of that, I could be at home if the ship had been tested. So I'm taking up an MIQ room, which is sadly needed.
So what is your message to the COVID response minister, Chris Hipkins, around this issue?
I think he needs to be consistent. They need to test everybody. You know, they test the flight crews, but these guys coming in on ships aren't being isolated and aren't being tested. So it's just consistency. We want to see, after 14 days, ships should be tested. 14 days since they departed the last port, the crew should be tested, and it frees up customs and it makes sure that everybody going around the New Zealand coast is safe.
So absolutely anyone coming via New Zealand to join a ship, in your view, should spend 14 days in managed isolation?
Absolutely, yeah. There's no hesitation, because these guys are coming out of the community, going into a ship and working with stevedores, pilots, all that sort of providores. They all come into touch with these people. So that fence isn't there. And so you don't know what the condition is. And one of the reasons, I'm in managed isolation, is they turn around and say to me, we don't know what the condition of the people are on the ship. So I said, well, go and test the guys. And they wouldn't do it.
But how would that work from a practical point of view? You'd be acutely aware of how jammed up MIQ is and how difficult it is to get a spot. So if all of these people had to come through MIQ, how practical is that for the industry?
Well, they arranged 500 Russians through Christchurch, so I'm sure a bit of planning. These guys only get relieved every 6 months, so it's not a huge amount of people coming through. The conditions that these international container ships and vessels are on is vastly different to what the New Zealand guys are on.
So to be clear, is it for you an issue of inconsistency?
Yes, that the joining crews come on and, to say, yes, it is. Inconsistent is the right word.
And how do you feel about that?
Well, I'm sitting in a hotel room when I shouldn't be here. I should be out skiing and with my family, but I'm here because of the inconsistency of the Port Health not enforcing the testing of ship's crew.
Captain Ian McLeod there. The dawn raids of the 1970s still haunt Pacific people to this day. Tingalao Ness, a New Zealand-born Niuean, is an activist with Polynesian Panthers. He's told the inquiry into abuse and care it was a racist attack based purely on the colour of their skin. Between 1973 and the early 80s, police and immigration targeted Pacific people in a bid to ferret out overstayers. Our reporter Andrew McRae has been at the inquiry in South Auckland.
66-year-old Tingalao Ness joined the Polynesian Panthers at the age of 16. The social justice group was set up in 1971 to target racial inequalities carried out against Pacific people and Māori. He says they formed a police investigation group known as the Pig Patrol to help stop police harassing and unlawfully arresting people.
What we felt was an oppressive regime targeting Pacific Island youth. So we knew that if we followed them around, they'd be less inclined to arrest and charge if they had witnesses watching what they were doing. So we were more or less patrolling the police.
He says the dawn raids started 47 years ago under the Labour government, but were ramped up by Prime Minister Robert Muldoon in 1975.
The police would bust into homes of brown people in the early hours of the morning and arrest anyone who didn't have ID or a passport. Anyone arrested was shipped out the same day. They would pull the bedding off you and shine the spotlight in your eyes. They would scream, yell and swear at our people, calling them names, telling them to get up and to get out, dragging our people out of their homes in whatever they were wearing.
In 1976, the raids intensified even further with Operation Pot Black. He describes the dawn raids as nothing more than abuse and state care.
The police and immigration were acting as swiftly as possible, either to fulfil a quota system or to prove their superiority or whatever it was. But they targeted people and straight away, without any hesitation, any representation, anything at all, shipped them straight out.
He says the raids weren't just on people in their homes, citing one example of a church gathering in Grey Lynn.
At least 60 churchgoers were rail-raided into police central headquarters, processed to see whether they were overstayers. The minister of that church was also processed. That only happens in South Africa and under the apartheid regime.
He says the dawn raids became a period of time that was hidden.
Turned certain Pacific Island people against each other. Some of the older ones, because of the authority and the shame and all that the overstaying issue dragged out.
A formal apology from the government for the dawn raids will be given at a ceremony in Auckland on Sunday, August the 1st. Tingalao Ness says it must be a full acknowledgement of what was done to Pacific Islanders.
That the truth come out about how our people were treated, about the racist attitude of this country and its government, about the institutionalised racism that all our people have suffered.
He says the dawn raids produced a sense of shame, fear, uncertainty and stigma.
People rushed the dance floors of nightclubs to mark the start of Freedom Day in England, with most of the remaining COVID restrictions now lifted. But the joy is likely to be short-lived as the country continues to see a rise in new cases. There's been fierce criticism of the policy of personal responsibility and of Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who remains in self-isolation. The BBC's Fergus Walsh has this report.
For some, this is what freedom looks like. No social distancing, very few masks. Many nightclubs across England reopened at midnight, 16 months since they were shut in the first lockdown.
It's felt like a dream, I feel like we've all waited for this moment for a long, long time.
I can literally not stress how much I've missed being able to go out and just dance and just have a laugh. It's been the best time.
But from the end of September, full vaccination will be a condition of entry to crowded venues like this.
We want people to be able to take back their freedoms.
The Prime Minister, self-isolating at Chequers, said proof of a negative test wouldn't be sufficient. Are you effectively giving people an ultimatum? Get vaccinated soon or you'll be denied entry to crowded venues?
Everybody has had an offer over 18 to get a vaccine. 3 million of the 18 to 30-year-old group have yet to take it up. All we're saying is, come on, folks, this is it. You won't regret it. It's the right thing to do.
Right the way across the world, we've seen that nightclubs and venues where you've got lots of people indoors, crowded together, are a focus for potential super spreading events.
But the plans have left the nighttime economy reeling.
It's devastating news. Freedom Day has all but lasted 17 hours, and then we've been hit with this overwhelming bombshell that September things are going to change again. So many people are angry and frustrated at this announcement.
Remember why all this matters. The number of COVID patients in hospital is just a tenth of the level last winter, but has doubled in 2 weeks as cases soar. Vaccination dramatically cuts the risk of dying and helps prevent the virus from spreading. And Labour wants face coverings to remain mandatory.
Lifting all restrictions in one go is reckless. And doing so when the Johnson variant is clearly out of control risks a summer of chaos.
And it's time for some of your feedback now. A number of you getting in touch about the immigration situation and the story Nick Trubridge did around doctors. This person says, I think it's unreasonable to invite people to come here to fill our professions, then make them wait to tell them whether they'll be allowed to stay. It was bad enough sponsoring my husband in 17 years ago. It seems to be getting worse. Perhaps immigration should bring in suitably trained immigration officers to handle our backlog. Couple of hundred by the look of it, says Ingrid from Gisborne. This one says, with respect to talented overseas trained doctors, please can we train New Zealand doctors? We especially need Māori doctors to address inequality. Improving conditions for Kiwi doctors so they don't go offshore would also plug the gap in the interim. And Shirley says, really disappointed with Immigration New Zealand, especially with their decision over medical professionals.
RNZ News at 6, ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leata with DNA. The government has refused to be interviewed about its surprise condemnation of China for state-sponsored hacking. New Zealand late last night joined an unprecedented grouping of United States allies, blaming damaging cyber attacks on China's State Security Ministry. The Minister for Intelligence Agencies, Andrew Little, has declined interviews today, and a spokesperson says he has no more to add to the statement. The Chinese embassy says the claims are groundless and irresponsible. Auckland's mayor says it's remarkable his city hosted the America's Cup during the pandemic, which he blames for the event making a national loss of $293 million. An evaluation report shows that for every dollar spent hosting the event, less than half was recovered. Auckland itself had a net loss of $91 million. Phil Goff says most of the council's expenses were on infrastructure, which will continue to benefit Aucklanders, but it's still disappointing.
We didn't get the influx of international visitors, and nor did we get the super yachts that would have contributed hundreds of millions of dollars with their refits and their expenditure within Auckland.
Phil Goff says Japan will be feeling much the same, having spent billions on an Olympics without crowds. The hospital in Westport, which was evacuated during the weekend floods, will remain out of action for at least most of this week. The chief executive of the West Coast DHB, Peter Bramley, says the hospital itself is okay, but the underground area where the boiler is located was flooded, cutting off heating and hot water. He expects it will take 3 to 4 days before staff and patients can move back in. Te Pāti Māori is accusing the ACT Party of separatism, which its latest policy proposals for combating gang-related crime. Under the policy, the police could apply to the courts to slap restrictions on any person on the national gang list, such as barring them from certain locations or requiring them to attend rehab. Te Pāti Māori co-leader Rawiri Waititi says that would just target the marginalised and the disenfranchised.
This is absolutely separatist. It is absolutely apartheid. It's state control over who we can interact with, who can be whānau and who can't be whānau. And I'm absolutely really disappointed that the ACT Party has gone down this track. But I'm not surprised.
Rawiri Waititi says the real solution is to reconnect people to their whenua and culture. Kiwi Rail says it's too early to tell if human error caused 2 carriages to break away from a commuter service between Auckland and Hamilton. The Te Huia train was heading toward Pukekohe yesterday afternoon when, without warning, it pulled apart, causing the emergency brakes to lock on. The driver backed up and reattached the carriages. Kiwi Rail's Acting Chief Operating Officer Walter Rushbrook says the fact the couplings could be reconnected doesn't rule out a technical problem.
The investigation will be looking at the couplings, the train handling, the track conditions. The train also has a black box on board, so that we'll find out information about the characteristics of the train right at the point of the parting.
The service is expected to resume tomorrow. 6 weeks after Peru's presidential election, the socialist candidate Pedro Castillo has finally been confirmed as the winner. After casting doubt on the result, his right-wing rival Keiko has now accepted the ruling of the National Electoral Authority. The BBC's Michael Duncan reports.
Pedro Castillo is a political newcomer, a left-wing primary teacher from rural Peru who was little known before he led a national strike 4 years ago. He's rarely without his white, wide-brimmed hat and likes to don a poncho and shoes made of recycled tyres. He says he will not take his presidential salary and instead will continue to live on a teacher's wage.
It's 4 minutes past 6. Pulse netball coach Gail Parata is leaving just after a year in the job. Parata was appointed in September, taking over from Yvette McCausland-Jury, who led the Pulse to 2 ANZ Premiership titles. But she now says she wants a role where she can build a program from scratch. The Pulse are out of playoff contention for this year's title. The New Zealand under-24 men's football team will be without one of their 3 overage players for their Olympic opener against South Korea on Thursday night. Experienced defender Michael Boxall has yet to be released by his Major League Soccer club Minnesota United after picking up a thigh injury earlier this month. New Zealand coach Danny Hayes says Boxall is a big part of their plan, so they're willing to wait until their 3rd group game.
The leadership that he can show and bring towards a young group, I think, was going to be vitally important. And he is, you look at the level he's playing at, he's in the MLS, and he's considered one of the very best, if not the best central defender in the league.
2 members of Mexico's baseball team are the latest Olympic athletes to test positive for COVID-19. They returned the tests before leaving for Tokyo. England's Football Association has ordered an independent review of the disturbances during the Euro 2020 final against Italy at Wembley. The final, won by Italy in a penalty shootout, was marred by clashes between English fans and officials in and around the stadium. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Eric Crampton, Chief Economist of the New Zealand Initiative, joins us once again. He's been taking a look at heritage regulations. Should we shift from using regulation to protect heritage to using spending to fund heritage? In the sampler, Tony Stamp reviews the 3rd album by Aussie up-and-comers the Goon Sax and the long-awaited debut album of local Silver Scroll winners, Lips. That's Nights with me, Anna Thomas, in for Brian Crump after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Taranaki, including Coromandel Peninsula. Long fine breaks, isolated showers. Rain spreading south tomorrow afternoon and evening. For Bay of Plenty and central high country, becoming fine tonight. A few showers developing tomorrow morning, then rain tomorrow night. Whanganui and Manawatu, also Gisborne to Wairarapa. Fine tonight. Isolated showers in Whanganui, Manawatu and Gisborne. High cloud tomorrow, a period of evening rain. Horowhenua to Wellington, mainly fine, the odd shower. A few showers tomorrow morning, then evening rain. For Nelson and Marlborough, also Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, mainly fine tonight. Isolated showers, widespread showers tomorrow, then rain from the evening, briefly heavy. For Canterbury, Otago and Southland, fine. Areas of low cloud, rain spreading north from tomorrow afternoon. And Chatham Islands, rain clearing tonight, then cloudy periods. RNZ National at 7 minutes past 6.
Kia ora rā, Susana. No mai hoki mai. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei. You're listening to Checkpoint. New Zealand Cybersecurity Agency believes China's been behind numerous hack attacks spanning years, and it's left behind telltale fingerprints. New Zealand has joined Western allies and Japan in calling out Beijing for so-called state-sponsored hacks, including a major incursion in February when Microsoft email services were targeted. The US has charged 4 Chinese nationals, 3 security officials and 1 contract hacker with targeting dozens of companies and government agencies in the United States and overseas under the cover of a front tech company. The boss of the Government Communications Security Bureau, Andrew Hampton, explains how they've figured out it's China.
What we do is when we see malicious cyber activity on New Zealand networks, now that may be through our own capabilities that we have to help protect New Zealand networks, or it may be something that's reported to us. We look at the malware that's used, we look at how the actor behaves, we look at who they might be targeting and what they do if they get onto a network, and that allows us to build a bit of a picture of who the actor is. We then compare that with information that we receive often from our intelligence partners who are also observing such activity, and that allows us to make an assessment, and it's always a probability assessment about who the actor is. In this case, because of the amount of information that we've been able to access, both from our own capabilities and from our partners, we've got a reasonably high level of confidence that the actor who we've seen undertaking this campaign over a number of years, and in particular who was responsible for the Microsoft Exchange compromise, was the APT40 group, that's Advanced Persistent Threat Group 40, which has been identified as associated with the Chinese Ministry of State Security.
So basically, these criminals, in essence, they leave technical fingerprints or a calling card that you become familiar with over time, and you have linked those signs back to China.
That's exactly it. I guess the only point I would clarify is the actors here are state-sponsored actors rather than what we would normally define as a criminal group, who is someone who's acting on their own accord for, say, financial gain. What we're seeing here is a state-sponsored actor likely to be motivated by a desire to steal information.
Yeah, so how does that work? Do people who are employed by the Chinese government go out and hire themselves some hackers, or what happens?
What we've seen, unfortunately, is a blurring of the line between what a state agency can do and what a criminal group can do. And there's 2 dimensions to that. Firstly, there's some of the technical capabilities that previously only state organisations have now got into the hands of criminal groups. But also what we're seeing in a range of countries is individuals who may work part-time in a government intelligence agency and then may work part-time in a criminal enterprise, or they may have previously worked in a state intelligence agency and are now out by themselves but still have links back to the state.
So what are you saying? Does China pay these people, encourage these people, or what is the relationship between the parties?
We don't know the full detail of the nature of the relationship, but what we do know is the Ministry of State Security in China, for example, is a very large organisation with many thousands of employees. So they are big organisations with people on their payroll, but they also would have connections with other individuals and organisations. I think something else that's worth noting with regard to this most recent compromise involving the Microsoft Exchange is what we saw there is once the Ministry of state security actors had identified the vulnerability and exploited it, they then shared that information with a range of other actors, including criminal groups, so they too could exploit it. Now, this is obviously a real concern to see this type of behaviour occurring.
Do you know whether these people are all acting from outside of New Zealand, or is it possible that, well, China could have someone working for them here in terms of hackers or technical people?
No. All evidence is that these attacks are originating from mainland China.
And what is the end goal?
We can only speculate about what the motivation of the actors are, but it is likely to be an attempt to steal information, or possibly pre-position themselves on a system to be able to access information in the future. That's certainly what the state-sponsored actors' motivation would be.
Intellectual property, Andrew, is that what you're talking about? Pinching our intellectual property?
Well, if you go back to that 2018 campaign that New Zealand and others called out, it was very clear that the compromise of the global managed service providers was to get to commercial information and intellectual property. So I'm sure that could be one of the motivations, but it could also be state secrets as well. We can only speculate.
And when you say positioning themselves in the system for a later time, are you talking about waiting there spying on us?
A common tactic we see, unfortunately, is there may be a vulnerability in a system, for example, and it could be a generic vulnerability across all users of that particular system, and a malicious actor may become aware of that vulnerability, and so they would use that to get onto the network. That doesn't mean that they will then start exfiltrating data from day one or something like that. They may just want to sit there in the event that at some point in the future they may want to start doing that. This exploitation of known vulnerabilities is a real concern. This is why all organisations need to keep their security patches up to date, because what can happen is you can have malicious actors who use technology to scan whole countries to look to see who hasn't updated their patches. They then use that vulnerability to get on the network, and then they may not do anything with that for some time, or they might produce a list of these are all the organisations, say in New Zealand, who haven't updated their patches, and then they make a decision, okay, well, these are the 4 or 5 that we want to further exploit.
Okay, so when it comes to China then, and the groups that it is encouraging, sponsoring, use whatever words you like, have they successfully managed to execute an attack on New Zealand assets, whether they be government or private companies?
What I can say is much of the activity that we have seen, we were able to observe before a compromise occurred. There were a small number of organisations that we're aware of where the actor managed to get onto their systems. In those cases, we worked with the organisations to remediate that as quickly as possible. But it was a small number of organisations over a period of years.
And that's the Director General of the Government Communications Security Bureau, Andrew Hampton. It is 6:15 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Almost 90 West Coast families are needing a new roof over their heads after flood waters raged through the region on the weekend. A community hub has been set up so residents can get medical, insurance, animal welfare and financial support. But so far, 89 properties have severe or total damage and 400 homes with moderate damage. Our reporter Samantha G is in Westport and filed this story.
Chantel Murphy has been busy trying to help her elderly friends and neighbours in Westport since the floods.
I was searching evacuation centres to find Alma first, just because she had no family here and I'd seen on Facebook, so I found her first. And then I found these other guys here and I've just run around and got what I can where I can, done washing, just help clean up, take them to their homes. I've done 7 trips to the supermarket alone yesterday afternoon, just whatever you can do,
Close to 100 people are at the newly opened evacuation centre at Westport South School, where she's been volunteering, with more at the Kiwi Holiday Park and the Carter's Beach Top 10 Holiday Park.
There's a lot of crying, it's emotionally draining, but you know what, people are just they're tired. They've got nowhere to go to their bed. So just keep going. You want to help, and the only way you make a difference is to work hard, and it won't last forever. So there's plenty of time to sleep next month, isn't there? So today's important, and just to give hugs, to talk to people, make them a cup of tea, just makes a world of difference for them today.
Her home escaped the worst of the flood damage. Her underfloor pink bats are sodden, and she's lost everything in her shed. She says the community is rallying together to support each other.
It is incredible. They're so strong and resilient, and this town is beautiful. We're so lucky, but unlucky. So just amazing people. They're so brave and they're so strong. I know we don't have a choice, but just everyone's helping and donating, and you just see movement everywhere. No one's sitting and wallowing in their self-pity, which they deserve because they've lost their home. So I'm so proud of everyone.
Fellow volunteer Janine Nell says they're trying to make people as comfortable as possible.
Sleeping arrangements is pretty good. I'm surprised because some people have got proper beds that they can sleep on. We try and get the elderly people that are struggling at decent beds to sleep on. We've been given so many mattresses and blankets. Unfortunately it's not home, but we've tried to make it as comfortable as possible.
She says they'll need to find accommodation before school goes back next week. The flooding forced the evacuation of Buller Hospital, with 11 patients and equipment in tow. West Coast DHB Chief Executive Peter Bramley says it was an unsettling time for patients, but they've set up a makeshift ward in Club Buller. He says the hospital itself is okay.
Unfortunately, the underground was completely flooded, and that took out our boiler, which provides both heating and hot water, which are both essential for a hospital setting. So as soon as the water's cleared and all of the generators back up and running, and the electrics have been checked, then we'll be back in action. But we anticipate that'll probably take 3 or 4 days at least before we can move back in.
At least 16 hospital staff have been severely impacted by the floods. Mr Bramley says the DHB is doing what it can to support them. The DHB's General Manager, Philip Weeble, says vaccinations were put on hold during the flooding.
We postponed the clinic this week, but we're really keen to continue to move forward on that. So certainly in terms of Northern Buller, that is still going ahead. But for Westport itself, what we're looking at is once we are able to move back into this facility, free up the COVID clinic that we have here, we will kick right back into doing the vaccinations here.
Further up the South Island, Marlborough is preparing for the mammoth task of clearing the debris scattered around the region. Queen Charlotte Drive and a number of other local roads remain closed or damaged by the torrential rain. Marlborough Civil Defence Controller Richard McNamara says they're trying to urgently repair smashed sewage pipes.
A lot of our ground is so saturated, and a lot of the stop tanks are extremely wet, and if they are subjected to further heavy flooding, it could well be an issue.
While the clean-up is underway in both regions, it's slow going and won't be an easy task.
New Zealand's most successful sport at the 2016 Rio Olympics is well placed to repeat that feat at the upcoming Tokyo Games. New Zealand sailors won 4 medals, including a gold and 2 silvers in Brazil. And as Clay Wilson reports, at least 5 crews are well and truly in medal contention on Enoshima Harbour in Fujisawa City, 50 kilometres out of Tokyo.
Gold in Rio to the New Zealanders. That is a huge moment for Burling and Took. Names for the future.
They highlighted the sparkling on-water success for New Zealand at the Rio Olympics. 5 years on, Peter Burling and Blair Tuke are again to the fore as the country's sailing team look to add more medals to their impressive Games tally. The star duo will pilot one of 6 New Zealand boats in Tokyo, and Burling says they remain hugely motivated. Despite a flat tack 12 months, including an America's Cup defence, launching a sail GP team, and all the challenges of COVID-19.
So be able to jump back into the Olympic environment, which is something that is really that pinnacle of grassroots sailing, and be able to compete for New Zealand on the world's biggest sporting stage is something that makes us incredibly proud as well. So really fortunate to be able to keep all these disciplines going, and really looking forward to this final build-up into the Olympic Games and try and win another gold medal for New Zealand.
There is no shortage of expectation they will do just that. As defending Olympic champions and 6-time world champions, Burling and Tuke are clear frontrunners for the Games regatta.
Having America's Cup, a high-pressure event within sort of 6 months of that is beneficial for us, and there's some other members of the New Zealand sailing team too that's been really beneficial for us. So that's something we see as a positive, but it's also challenging, and I think that we may go in as favourites, but it's in this environment where there's going to be people that come bolters.
4 other New Zealand crews are strong medal contenders too. among them Josh Jr., who pipped Andy Maloney for the one berth available in the Finn class. But a long-standing agreement between the best mates means Maloney will act as coach in Tokyo, which Jr. is excited about after finishing 7th in Rio.
I think out of that I learnt some big lessons and realised that I need someone like Andy around. So, Andy and I have managed to form an amazing partnership together, and we both became world champions, and, that's something pretty special. And I think that what we've learnt off each other and how we complement each other has been really good. So the steps we've taken have given us a lot of confidence to race well.
Maloney, now 1 from 1 as a coach after Junior's victory at a high-level practice regatta in Spain last month, agrees the partnership's chances of success are good.
We're both pretty professional and we know when to switch from being quite relaxed and, tuned off when we're not trying to switch on. And then, when we get down to the boat park or when we're on the water or when we need to be doing debriefs or whatnot, we're able to switch into more of a coach and sailor relationship.
Speaking of relations, Maloney will have sister Alex for company in Tokyo, while her 49er FX partner Molly Meach is joined by brother Sam, who won laser class bronze in Rio. There's also the father-son combination of Hamish and Dan Wilcox, the former Burling and Tukes longtime coach, and the latter gunning for a medal in the 470 alongside Paul Snow Hansen. The female 49er FX duo also stood on the dais in Brazil, and Molly Meach says one better than those silver medals is definitely the target.
Obviously we're heading into this Olympics with our sights set on the gold, but we're also very aware that it's a different situation, and also the fleet's got a lot closer this cycle. So if we stick to our processes and routines and go out there and put down a performance that we're happy with, then hopefully the result will get taken care of.
The same goes for Burling and Tuke. Back-to-back gold, a feat achieved by just 13 New Zealanders May Beckon, but Burling says there's a lot of water between them and Olympic history.
As an athlete, you just enjoyed that challenge of being able to go and put your skills on the line and see if you can beat the other best in the world, and that's a bit that really motivates us to keep pushing forward.
That push begins at Inoshima on July 25th, with 6 boats gunning to yet again be New Zealand's best performed Olympic sport.
South Africa's former president Jacob Zuma appeared on a video link from prison today to attend his trial for corruption. It's the first time he's been seen since he was sent to jail for contempt of court. His imprisonment sparked several days of looting and arson, in which more than 200 people died. The BBC's Andrew Harding reports.
The clean-up is well underway here in Johannesburg. President Cyril Ramaphosa touring the well-swept remains of a shopping mall in Soweto at the weekend.
They went in and they took the cell phones and so forth.
He's seeking to reassure a nervous, angry nation, not just that an attempted insurrection has been defeated, but that the experience has made the country stronger.
This incident has really united us, it has solidified us, and we must emerge out of this much, much stronger than we were. We shall never be defeated.
Within the governing party, the ANC, there are plenty who agree, who see the chaos of the past week as an opportunity, maybe a turning point. Ronnie Casrils is a former minister and fierce critic of Jacob Zuma, the former president whose imprisonment sparked the turmoil.
I think that Ramaphosa will come out of it stronger. I think that the Zuma grouping have misread the situation, that the country is aghast at what's happened. I think that we'll see Ramaphosa growing in strength. One hopes it's the silver lining that shakes up an ANC that has increasingly become moribund, driven by these cliques and the factions, the corruption of the Zuma years.
But the scale of the challenge facing South Africa should not be underestimated. Yes, the looters will eventually skulk away. There will presumably be a reckoning for those proved to have organised or incited the violence, not least on social media.
And bear in mind, we are one massacre away, just one massacre away from a complete spiraling out of control of the situation. For the people that are protesting and looting, please do so carefully and please do so responsibly.
That was former President Zuma's son, Duduzane. And yes, he did call for responsible looting. The police now say they have a dozen or more suspected ringleaders in their sights. Arrests are promised. But will that be enough? South Africa is an angry, jobless, profoundly unequal society with a weak opposition and a governing party at war with itself.
Amazon founder and the world's richest person, Jeff Bezos, is set to travel into space in just a few hours. It's part of the billionaire space race and the planned commercialisation of space. CNN's Tom Foreman has this report on what Bezos can expect on his journey.
At Blue Origin's arid testing ground, the 60-foot rocket is slated to take off at 8 a.m. Central Time.
Command start, 2, 1.
Just as it has already in more than a dozen test flights, a 1,000,000-horsepower blast from the liquid-fueled engine will start the journey. The astronauts will be strapped into a ring of futuristic space seats. About a third of the capsule is made of windows, and the rocket will steadily rotate, changing the view. Riding will be their only job.
It's an autonomous vehicle. It's been designed so that the customers, the astronauts themselves, can experience the flight.
Over the first 2 minutes, their speed will literally rocket to more than 2,000 miles an hour. G-forces will intensify until each person feels as if they weigh 3 times as much as normal. But that won't last. At 2 minutes and 45 seconds, the booster engine will fall away. 15 seconds later, as the capsule arcs toward the highest point in the flight, the passengers will start to feel much lighter. And at 4 minutes, 62 miles up, they will be unbuckled.
You'll get to experience about 3 to 4 minutes of weightlessness, again, to gaze out of those big, beautiful windows, maybe do a couple of somersaults.
I don't know how it's going to change me, but I know it's going to, and I'm excited to find out how.
He'll have to find out fast. Roughly 6 minutes into the flight, they will return to their seats and start falling back to Earth, eventually going so fast they'll break the sound barrier just as they did going up. They won't likely see the booster engine land a couple of miles from the launch pad. And once they are close enough to Earth, about 9 minutes after taking off, parachutes will deploy to slow their descent to 15 miles an hour. Then a retro thrust system will fire just before touchdown.
Really, by the time the capsule lands, it's just at about 1 or 2 miles an hour.
It won't be anything like orbital flight or what truly trained astronauts do, but it should be quite an experience. And at the going rate of $2.5 million per minute, it ought to be.
I don't know if I'd be keen to go to space. Anyway, Terry's got in touch with his thoughts on immigration and the problems being faced by doctors waiting to hear what their immigration status is. Terry says, as a Northlander, I'm very concerned that the Immigration Department is messing around and properly communicating with 2 very necessary medical people who simply should be clearly allowed to stay here indefinitely. Surely there is some ability for the department to use some common sense, says Terry, and flexibility when it comes to highly sought after medical people. If it requires a law change, then the government needs to get on with it. And on the subject of cybersecurity and various nations, including New Zealand, calling China out as a hack attacker, this person says, I think you'll find that New Zealand is collateral damage in the cyber war between the USA and China. New Zealand's internet, etc., is totally dependent on the US, who could easily pull New Zealand's internet plug if we do not support the United States. What appears obvious is that China's technology tops the US's. Now, from 5 o'clock tomorrow morning, ko te kaupapa tuatahi a pōpō. First up at 5, we'll have the Maritime Union on how shipping crews should be handled if they come down with COVID. We'll catch you again tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. New Zealand's Cyber Security Agency says telltale digital fingerprints have led them to believe China is behind numerous hack attacks. Auckland's mayor says most of the city's money spent on the loss-making America's Cup was on infrastructure that will benefit ratepayers. Kiwi Rail says it's too early to determine whether a technical problem or human error caused 2 carriages to break away from a commuter service between Auckland and Hamilton. State Highway 2 at the Remutaka Hill Road is now open following an earlier fatal crash. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 7. Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
The fire brigade's been helping people today.